Alright guys, today we're going to be on page 7 of the note packet. We are going to talk about some angle vocab, what they look like, how to name them, kind of like how we started this unit a couple days ago. The first term, an angle, is the intersection of two rays at an endpoint. So remember, a ray only goes on in one direction. So I'm having two of them put together here. So I could have A, B, C. So notice my two rays, BA and BC, put together. They form an angle that way. Now to name an angle, there's multiple different ways to do this. The first way is to start at one of the two arrows and then trace it. So if I start at A, and I'm going to trace it down to follow it, I'm at B, and then back over to complete it, I'm at C. So I started at A, went down to B, and then over to C. Squish them all together, and then put the angle symbol in front of them. Now you could reverse the order. So you could start at C, go to B, and then go to A to finish it. So I started at C, go down to B, and then up to A to finish it. And again, an angle symbol. Now you might notice that in both of those, the middle letter is B. Well, if we jump down, a vertex is the common endpoint of an angle. So where they intersect. The common endpoint. So the one that they both share. So B. And so B will be in the middle because it is the vertex, which lets us have one more way to name it, and that is just by the vertex. Now that only happens if there is only one angle happening there, so we'll get into the point where there's multiple angles happening, and we wouldn't be allowed to use that. So the safe bet is to use 3 letters at a time. You can get away with one every once in a while. And again, in this case, B is the vertex, it's the middle point. So maybe note that it's the middle point. And since it's a point, we just use capital letters. Congruent angles are angles that have the same measure. So what they're going to do, in segments we had something called tick marks, in angles we have something called arc marks. As long as they have matching arc marks, that means they are congruent angles. We could up that count if we needed to, and we could put 2 in each of them. And again, they are still equal as long as their arc marks match. A right angle is an angle with a degree measure of 90 degrees. They will tell you that it's 90 degrees by putting a box in the corner. Do not assume there is a box unless there is a box. Just because it might look like 90 doesn't mean it is. An acute angle is an angle with a degree measure less than 90 degrees. Notice that it doesn't say less than or equal to. So it can be 89.9999999, but it cannot be 90. And it can be anything less than that. An obtuse angle is an angle with a degree measure greater than 90 degrees. So again, it can be 90.1, but it cannot be 90. And looks something like that. Perpendicular. 2 lines that intersect at a 90-degree angle. So if we notice here, we have our 2 lines. Let's say it's lines L and M. There's going to be a right angle there. That means they're perpendicular. And there's a symbol for that. The symbol is this upside down capital T. So if I wanted to tell you that these lines are perpendicular, I would say L is perpendicular to M. And again, we don't always have to use lowercase cursive letters, but sometimes that's what's easier. An angle bisector. An angle bisector is a line or ray that divides an angle into 2 equal parts. So how I would know that that's doing that, I would have my arc marks here to show me that those are equal parts. Now the most important part for today are these angle relationships. And what I really need you to understand is that these angle relationships are actually angle pairs. Because in all of these, there's 2 angles being paired up together. complementary and supplementary angles are kind of their own being, and they're separate. Complementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 90. So I have these two angles here. Let's say that one is 70 and one is 20. We add those two together, we get a sum of 90. It has to equal 90, nothing more, nothing less. Supplementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 180. So I have these two angles here. Let's say one is 145 and the other is 35. If I add those together, I will get 180. So those agree. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, these three, you've probably never seen before. Let's start with adjacent. Adjacent angles are two angles that are next to each other and share a common side. So they are next to each other, share a common side. So what that means to me, if I wanted to make that into modern language for you guys, is I like to think of these guys as holding hands. So if I take my two angles, notice what happens. I got one angle here, I have another angle here, and watch. What happens? Well, that middle one kind of turns green because they're holding hands at that middle bar. So they are next to each other. So in this case, if I label these angles 1 and 2, angles 1 and 2 would be adjacent because that middle bar is shared between the two of them. Vertical angles are two angles across from each other on intersecting lines. They are always congruent. So there's two important things there. Across from each other, and they are always congruent. So they're always equal. Well, if I look, I have a couple different angles happening here. I have this angle, and I have this angle, and I have this angle, and I have this angle. Across from each other, think about when you're sitting at a table. You're sitting across from each other at the booth if one's on one side and one's on the other. Adjacent is where you're next to, so when you're sitting directly next to someone on a booth. If you're across from them, you're across the way. So if I labeled these, actually across from each other would be like 1 and 3. They can't touch each other unless they reach across the table from each other. And then that would make angles 2 and 4, also across from each other. Now, if I wanted to use this picture for adjacent, well, 1 and 4 could be considered adjacent because they are sharing this bar right here. And you can pull out a lot from that example, but across from each other, they're across the way from each other. These angles always form an X. So vertical angles always form an X. And they're always congruent, so we could come in here and we could add in our congruent marks. 4 is congruent to 2. Well, I've already used 1 arc mark, so I have to make 1 congruent to 3. So I have to up the total amount of arc marks. A linear pair. Notice that a linear pair has some vocab in there that we've already seen. Adjacent and supplementary angles that always form a straight line. So if they're adjacent, they must be next to, and if they're supplementary, they must add to 180. And they have to form that straight line. So what happens here is when you trace them, I trace one of my angles, I trace another one of my angles, and you'll notice that that middle bar does turn green, so we do have adjacent angles so far. But we also, if we look at the whole picture and we trace the whole thing all at once, you'll notice if I trace it without picking up my pencil, so boop, up, and then back down and over, I have completed a line. So the linear pair must be adjacent, touching, holding hands, and it must form a line. So if I look through all of these and see what they are, well, if I highlight, I like to highlight my angles. So if you have a highlighter, you need to do that too. 1 and 2. Well, did I trace any bar and see that it turned, well, actually, yeah, we want to use different colors for you guys. So did I trace any bar and see that it changed colors? No. So I'm not adjacent because I'm not holding hands. Vertical, am I across the table from them? Am I forming an X? Yeah, I am. Complementary and supplementary. Well, I can't do either of those because I don't have angle measures. I don't see any 90-degree angles. I don't see any degree marks, so I can't do that. And then linear pair. You can only select linear pair if you have selected adjacent, because that's in the definition. Have I selected adjacent? No. So I can't even consider that. I recommend you go in the order that they tell you to. All right, on 2. If I trace it, I have 1. And I have 2. Did I trace any bar twice? Did I have it change colors? Yeah, I did. So it's got to be adjacent. If you are adjacent, you can never be vertical at the same time because by definition, one is next to and one is across from. Those cannot line up together. So if I select adjacent, I cannot select vertical. Complementary or supplementary? Well, I see something that could help me out. I see a right angle here. If it's a right angle on one side, it has to be a right angle on the other. My two angles, angles 1 and 2, together form a right angle. The one that means that is complementary. Supplementary means add to 180. A linear pair says 2 angles that add up to equal 180. Well, what did my angles add up to equal? 90. And do my 2 angles form a line? No. So I can't be a linear pair. I am adjacent, so it's an option, but I do not form a line with only 2 angles. I form a line with all 3, but these are angle pairs, so I can't use that. Number 3. If I highlight 1 and I highlight 2, did I highlight a bar at the same time? Yeah. So that would make them adjacent. By definition, if you choose adjacent, you cannot choose vertical. Do I have any degree marks in there, any right angles? I don't, so I can't look at complementary or supplementary. For linear pair, they must be adjacent, so I meet that requirement. Now trace them together and see if you form a line. 1 and 2. Did I form a line? Yeah, I did. So I have to be a linear pair. On number 4, if I trace angle 1 and then trace angle 2, did I trace a bar for both? Yeah, the middle one. So they must be adjacent. Therefore, by definition, they cannot be vertical. I see no indication of how much those equal or any right angle marks, so I can't look at supplementary or complementary. Do those 2 angles together form a line? No such luck. So just adjacent there. Number 5. Now, number 5 and 6 are tricky, so I would like to save those till the class meeting. But what I would like you to do is I would like you to turn to page 10 and complete 1 through 9 as your homework. So make sure that you do that and bring any questions you may have to your class meeting tomorrow.